Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Thursday, April 24th, 2025, episode 370, and we're going to talk about a quote unquote debate strategy for the less informed. I emphasize less informed because we're not really talking about ill-informed. Ill-informed is someone who has bad information or wrong information, inaccurate information. So we're not talking about the ill-informed, right? Because generally people who are ill-informed tend to be the type of person who is going to be someone who has strong opinions and they hold on to them strongly, as we talked about yesterday in the last episode. But we're going to talk about someone who has less information, someone who doesn't really have a lot of information on a particular subject. And this generally happens a lot. It happens to me all the time. And this is why I came up with this method. When I was younger, and I've shared in other episodes before that when I was younger, studying was not actually my strong suit. I had reasoning skills, rational ability, but I just really didn't have a whole lot of a library information. And maybe I have a little bit more than other people, but I always compare myself to my father. And my father started reading books in English when he was in Korea, when he was in elementary school. All right. He was a beast when it came to academics. He taught himself English enough that he could read Socrates, Plato, Plato's writing on Socrates, and he would give little seminars to people much older than him, but who are uneducated, right? But he would give lectures and seminars to people who were much older than him because they couldn't read the English and they never read the works. And he would do that when he was in middle school. So he was reading philosophy ever since he was a small child. And then when I entered a doctoral program, my dad suggested that I do something in philosophy. And in my head, I was like, there is no way I'm going to catch up to 30, 40 years of philosophy, right? So he's been studying philosophy for 30, 40 years at that point, much more than that. But there's no way that I, as a late bloomer, was going to be able to read, decades of philosophy books in a year or two. There's just no way I was going to be able to do that. And a lot of my classmates too, they read so much more than me. So I decided that there was no way that I was going to be able to catch up with their library of information and that was in their head. So I decided that I was going to try to come up with a shortcut, right? A way that uh, the reality of my having less information was not necessarily a weakness. It wasn't necessarily something that kept me out of the game or meant that I would automatically lose any kind of so-called debate, right? Or discussion. And those of you who've engaged in conversations like this, it's not a debate, a formal debate, but one person does want to demonstrate or sort of uh, let you know that they know more than you. Okay, so those kinds of conversations happen all the time. And so for me, it's, I just didn't want to have someone who clearly is not the best informed to think that they got one up on me, right? I didn't want that to happen either. So I came up with a strategy which I'm about to share with you now. And the reason why I decided I was going to share it, and I've given you bits and pieces of it on this channel in the past, early on, like in my deconstruction videos, I think in the single digit episodes, there I talk about deconstruction, and that is basically where I get my debate methodology. But I decided I was going to do this episode because I was listening to Dave Smith comment on his detractor and critics from his debate with Douglas Murray. And, there are lots of styles of debate, and a lot of them generally depend on having lots of information. Or in the Murray's case, strong opinions strongly held with very little support, right? So Murray, I guess his best asset is his accent, right? People with a British accent to American ears, they generally sound smarter, even though they're not really smarter at all. And so, in order to refute a lot of things that points that Murray would raise, you need to have lots of counter information. And so I thought about that and I said, yeah, I would never be able to go on a debate. I mean, maybe if I had time and I did research and whatnot, but, clearly people who are showing up to the debate would have much, much more information. There was no way that I was going to be able to be on their level, right? And that's why they are challenging me to a debate because they know they have more information than me. It kind of reminds me of my legal case, my arbitration that I'm going with the university. Clearly, the university believes they have a mountain of evidence against me. And so what am I going to do in the face of all of this evidence? And it's the same thing I do in all of my classrooms and what I'm about to teach you or share with you. I don't want to presume, but to share with you my method. And maybe you do the same thing. But my method is basically let the other person talk, especially if they're upset. And usually, if they're talking to me, they're upset. Okay. So I let them talk, right? And that's what they want to do. They want to talk, they want to vent all of their grievances and just dump it, or I would say vomit all of that onto me all at once. And I'm not going to impede that person. I'm just going to let that person talk. And letting the other person talk is not a bad method in a conversation, right? Or in an angry conversation, unless you're impatient, right? So this method that I'm about to share with you uh, doesn't really work so well if you are an impatient kind of person. A bunch of my students said that I was really chill, so kind of patient, I guess. But I'm really not. It's just that I've trained myself that when you're in this kind of situation, being impatient is not the way to go. So if you are impatient and you are prone to interrupting the other person and interjecting, this strategy might not work. Okay. But you can train yourself to do this, right? I got to say that some of my students have already, middle school students have already started to use this, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But if you are going to try to interrupt, like you're not going to sit back and let this person talk, then it means that you have to be well informed on pretty much everything. And that's not really possible. There will be, as I said already, there will be topics in certain areas of life where you are not the most informed person and that your conversation partner or slash opponent will know more than you. So that's a very tricky game, risky game to play. And I'm risk averse. And so I just let that person talk. In other words, you're going to be frequently out informed, right, by the other person. So it's an easy position because all you're doing is listening and asking questions for clarification, right? And so the burden of knowing a lot and having an airtight argument is on the other person, right? Because you're not going to interject. You're not going to push back at any point. You're just letting that person speak their mind. And if they're angry with you and you try to be consistent in your life and they're angry with you, it generally means that they have a misunderstanding. And so you're letting them talk, they're venting, they're saying everything that they understand. And what you're doing is listening and looking for that misunderstanding or the weakness in their argument. That's what's really important. You let them talk, but at the same time, you are trying to remember as much as possible. And what helps is for you to say, hey, I don't have a lot of information about this. I confess I'm really don't know too much. And so why don't you tell me what's going on? And when you say something like that, it puffs up the other person. It allows your debate partner, the person you're arguing with, to feel a little bit more comfortable, to feel arrogant, right? To feel like they know more than you. Ha ha, I got this guy. And so they run their mouth even more. Maybe it's bad that you don't know too much about that topic, Or maybe you do, but you think that the person knows more, so you're not going to say, "Oh, I know a little bit," right? So it might be a bad thing that you don't know too much about this topic, which the other person clearly believes is super important, or the topic really isn't that important, which is why you don't know too much about it, right? It's something very eclectic, something sort of subtle, something that they're making a big deal out of a subtle difference that really doesn't need to exist. Right. And that's it. You just listen and you ask questions. What kind of questions do you ask? Well, you ask questions like, what do you mean by that? Right. How are you using that word? uh, oh, you said this. What does that mean? Right. And so you're playing it's not really faking, right? Because you really don't know what this person is saying and you want clarification. You want to know for sure exactly what this person means. Right. The devil is in the details, right? And so you're making that person, and it's highly likely that the person never really got down to the nitty-gritty details. And so the conversation is over very quickly, right? If you say, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" Or "How are you using that word? Can you give me a definition of that word?" And if they hesitate, it means no one has ever asked them that. They never had to think about it. They always assumed, right? They always assumed they knew what the meaning was, but when they have to put it into words, maybe they don't. Okay. And so then what happens when you do that, right, you're throwing them off their game because these are questions that are not normally asked, right? These are things that are not normally said. In other words, when you're in a heated discussion, or at least that person believes you're in a heated discussion, then generally, when they're yelling, you yell back. But you're not yelling back. You're just saying, "Oh, what does that mean? Oh, how are you using that word? What do you mean by that?" Right? Uh, why is that significant? Or my favorite, and I said this in episode 165, right? My favorite is just simply to ask why. Why? Right? Oh, why? And depending on what they just said, it's like, why is that important? Oh, why do I have to keep that in mind? Or why is it that they do this? Right? And so you're always asking why. And it's just like that annoying kid who keeps asking why. And after a while, you just don't have answers anymore. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to push this person to the edge of their knowledge block, right? The body of knowledge that they have, you're trying to push them to the edge, which prior to your conversation, they probably never had to explore because people would either argue, in other words, there's generally a script that is followed, and they know the script, and so they're going to just simply follow the script. Next, the person is going to push back against this, and so I say this. But if you're not pushing back at all, you're just simply asking questions, then what happens is this person is getting pushed to the edge of the information that they know. Now, the trick is, and this is what's really important, you have to try to remember as much of what that person has said as possible, right? This is also important when you're dating, right? You don't, especially if you have emotions already, emotions will lie to you. Emotions will make you think that you don't have to remember because this person is so beautiful and you're in love, right? They would never lie to you. Well, no, you got to remember everything, right? And so if you practice this a lot, trying to remember certain things, okay, then you can catch someone when they are not being totally honest with you. And remember why someone said something that wasn't totally on the level. You should explore that before you basically burn the bridge. Okay. But anyway, so you try to remember as much as possible. And as you're listening to the information, you're running all the information through your principle, which I've emphasized before on this channel. You need to have a life principle. And I've shared it with you every episode, right? I listen for anything that is coercive or anything that someone says which is hypocritical. Okay. And when I catch something that's hypocritical, I don't say, "Oh, hypocrite." I don't say that. I say, "Oh, that's a contradiction." Right? "Oh, you just contradicted yourself." You say, or to be even more polite, I'll say, "Oh, how did that jive with what you said earlier?" Right? "How does this work with that?" Right? And it might actually be a contradiction, but sometimes people, when in order to avoid embarrassment, and suddenly the tables are turned and now they're losing the argument, they double down. And they usually almost always double down, right? Now it becomes hypocrisy, right? Why is it wrong when they do it, but it's okay for you, right? And that becomes the very innocent question. And it's a second opportunity for the person to say, oh, whoa, I got to think about this some more, right? So that's the thing. When you say, oh, that's a contradiction, that's an opportunity for your opponent to say, oh, whoa, you're right. I have to rethink this. But if they double down, that's when you say, oh, now you're becoming, you're transgressing into the realm of hypocrisy. Second opportunity for them to, call it quits. But some people, they just keep on trucking, right? And so remember, in order to be able to pull this off, you have to remember as much as possible. And obviously, when the argument or the discussion goes on longer and longer, or when you've been talking over years with a person, it's very difficult to remember certain things. But after a while, you get to realize that there are certain things that you can flag, key points, which you know that if it's not true, will become a problem later. And you sort of try to remember those things. So you can't remember the whole conversation, but you can remember certain points which you're like, whoa, okay, that's significant. I wonder if that's true. And you file that away. And so then later on, when they've forgotten that they've said it, and then they say something which contradicts that, then you can bring it up. Okay. And you say, well, how about that? So were you wrong then, or are you wrong now? So I've taught this method of listening and watching for contradiction or for coercion, right? If you're going to force a lot of people to do something, then automatically it's a failure, right? It's not going to work. But I've taught this method to all of my students, whether they're in church or in university. But now I'm teaching it to my middle schoolers, right? These are sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, and they take it to like fish to water, right? They get it. Whether they're good at using the method is another matter, but some of them already were using that. They were using, and it's in there, right? I think it's part of our human mentality to be curious, right? And it seems that a lot of schools socialize that curiosity out. So you don't ask the question anymore. And the kids who ask the question are troublemakers, right? You're giving your teacher a hard time. But I encourage them to ask the questions. Like, even if you don't know what to ask, you just say, why? Right. And I tell them, I'm teaching this to them not to be disruptive, but for their protection. Right. If you do this as sort of as a habit without even thinking, you just ask, oh, why do I have to do this? Why are you so upset? Then you'll know when someone is about to play them, right? They'll know if someone is about to try to mislead them, to, give them bad information, or to make them feel like something is really important when it's really not. And a lot of my students are African American, and a lot of their parents try to tell them about institutional racism, systemic racism, etc. And so what I say flies in the face of a lot of what they're being taught in their family. And so I tell them, but you don't say, oh, my teacher at school said this. I tell them that's not the way you play it. What you do is you ask them why, and you try to walk them down the path that you just took, right? That I led them down to make them realize that it's a very, very thin argument, right? So it's for their protection, even against uh, parents who are misinformed, right? It's important in college to avoid indoctrination, and even in secondary school, when some of your well-intended teachers are just simply trying to share with you their, I don't know, whatever it is, their pet projects, I guess. And when I share this with them, I always tell them that I use this for peace, for de-escalation, and to seek for better choices. I never tell them that there are what the better choices might be, because I tell them that it can be any situation. And so the fact that I'm not indoctrinating them, but trying to give them a tool through which they can find better choices. I mean, they kind of embrace it. At least some of them do. And if they reject it and they want to go down the road of violence, they can do that, but they will be sorry. And it doesn't take a lot for them to realize that the road of violence is a dead end, right? It will end badly. So, especially after I talk about how destructive war is, how destructive violence is, like gang violence, or even violence between people having a fight, I mean, there's no benefit. Even the winners are losers, right? And as to middle schoolers, everyone is either bigger, older, or more educated. And so it's perfect, right? It's a perfect system. Um, I also emphasize too, and I'm going to emphasize it here, that this is an extremely powerful method. I've taken down professors with this, okay, my colleagues who are clearly smarter than me, but I've always been able to hold my ground using this method. And so I tell them, with great power comes great responsibility. You are not to use this to embarrass people. If you're using this and talking to your parents, you have to be especially careful. You do not use it to embarrass people. You do not use it to shame people, right? Because once they go down that road, they can react badly, and you don't want them to act badly. And so it's not about, ha ha, I got you to, realize something is contradictory. No, you just say, huh, you want people to realize that they've reached the limit of their knowledge. And then you end the conversation. You say, oh, but thanks for bringing that up. I got to look into this some more. Or, hey, this really is important. I got to think about this some more. You know, that's how you want to end it, right? And some people are okay with bad choices, right? Because they have high time preference. In other words, they look for immediate gratification, and living with a lie will allow them to do that. Well, you got to give them that space, right? So you'll say, "Oh, that's contradictory," or "That's hypocritical," and they say, "I don't care," and you're like, "Oh, okay, well then, see ya," right? And so you kind of leave it like that person can believe what they want, but it's not for you because it's hypocritical. And we, as educators and people who seek value, right? So I'm including myself with the middle schoolers, right? We have to be people who seek value, who try to build each other up, right? So we frame this Q&A, right, as a journey, right? And so you can express appreciation, appreciation for being introduced to a topic that you previously didn't know a whole lot about, right? But you say, but I'll take that into consideration. So here's an example that I had with someone. I had a conversation with someone about one of the wars that are going on right now. And he believed that the war was justified and was really gung-ho about all of the fighting. And so, I kept asking why and what do you mean by that? And he mentioned at one point that he wouldn't know what he would do. Like he would just go bonkers if something happened to his child. And that's when I said, but all those people that you support killing are someone's child, right? Or even their child was hurt previously. I mean, do you blame them, right? Advocate killing them for doing what you would do yourself if you were put in the same situation, right? Why would you hate them for doing the very thing that you said you would do if you were in that situation? And it got him to pause only for a moment because this was a type of person who would double down, triple down. Okay. So, but I left it like that. And I said, no, look, dude, you contradicted yourself. Okay. You're drifting into hypocrisy. And so the conversation for me is over. And so I ended it pretty much like that. Right. And I just merely repeated and I said, I prefer that all the killing stop. Like no one should have to see their child go through pain and suffering. Right. I want that pain and suffering to stop. I want all the waste that happens as a result of killing and all the violence stops. And especially since this economy is failing. And I kind of left it at that. I don't know what happened after that, But, I just kind of left it like you can believe what you want to believe, but, it's extremely problematic. So hopefully this is of some benefit to you, and that whenever you feel like, oh man, they know more than me, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? You can just use it as an opportunity to help the other person realize that either they have a rock solid idea or an extremely problematic one. All right. And the more you do this and over time, you'll already know that certain positions, just by how they're presented, are probably not bad ideas. But you don't know enough to be able to shoot it down. So you let the person talk and you let that person realize that that position is weak. That's it for today. I will talk to you next time.